Okay, so everybody, welcome to this month's session, actually, the first one of December of our Wednesdays at 1 presentations. My name is Kathy Albright, and I'm the project coordinator for the Employment Sector Council. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Lisa Roussel, who is, if I'm not mistaken, Lisa, you're the co-chair of our steering committee and our training and development committee. Am I correct?
That is correct.
Awesome. Okay, so in case you didn't know, our Wednesdays at 1 series is supported by the City of London as part of their efforts during and after the pandemic to drive community and economic recovery across the region by bringing us all together to learn, to share, and to connect with each other. We have one more great presentation that's planned for December, and it's next week. And we're in the planning stages of putting together additional sessions on really interesting topics actually in 2023. So we're hoping that you're going to continue to join us when you can. And as always, we love to hear any suggestions or any ideas that you have for future sessions. So if you happen to think of anything, I'm going to be putting my email address in the chat. So please feel free to either send an email to me or you can send it to info@esc.network, and we'll definitely take it into consideration. And as I mentioned before, this session is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto the Employment Sector Council website. So today I would like to introduce you to, and I'm very pleased to welcome, our presenter, Donald Guse Salah. Donald is the program manager for the Discoverability Network at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, responsible for stakeholder relations with community partners, strategic partnership development, and networking events. In his previous life, Donald was a program developer and supervisor of a supported employment program for job seekers with disabilities. He also founded and leads the Supported Employment Alliance, a collaborative network of supported employment programs operating across the Greater Toronto Area. As we're all aware, obviously, we wouldn't be on this call today if we weren't. Disclosing a disability to an employer is a critical part of the job search for people living with disabilities. Today, Donald will be providing us with information about disclosure, accommodations, and best practices so that you can help your job seekers with disabilities flourish both in interviews and on the job. So I really don't have anything more to say, so I'm going to hand it over to Donald. So Donald, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm shocking, I know, to everyone. I do have a slide deck to accompany my presentation, so give me a moment and I'll get it up on the screen. And there it is. You should see my screen. Kathy or Lisa, since you're the cameras, I can see. Can one of you just nod your head or give me a thumbs up? Great, wonderful, thank you. So I'm just going to make it full screen. There we go. So Kathy did a pretty good job of going through sort of what the agenda is going to be. I'm going to talk briefly about the Discoverability Network, just in case you don't know what it is, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation and the different elements of disclosure, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and hopefully I will just be able to provide some additional insight and considerations. We'll also talk a bit about accommodations and requesting accommodations, and I want to preface everything I'm going to say with if you have questions or thoughts, please feel free to raise your hand, your virtual hand. I can see very few cameras on my screen right now. But raise your virtual hand, put comments in the chat, and I'll try to monitor the chat. There should be an opportunity for Q&A afterwards, but certainly I'd welcome you to contribute during the presentation as well. So please don't be shy. So the Discoverability Network, if you are not familiar with it, is an Ontario Chamber of Commerce program that is designed to facilitate connections between job seekers with disabilities and businesses in order to address workforce needs. All of our services are free for all of our stakeholders, so job seekers, employment service providers, post-secondary institutions, businesses, and so on and so forth. We operate a job matching platform that matches candidates to roles based on fit and preference. We provide free training, such as the workshop that you are attending right now. And we provide consultation and tools to businesses, as well as run networking events and webinars in order to share best practices, resources, and make connections in order to support everyone's success. Now, having said that, we certainly would welcome you to support your job seekers to register on our platform. We think it's a great job search tool that is a valuable one for job seekers to have in their toolkit. We don't think they should only use our platform. We just think that it's one tool that they should be using amongst many others. And I have been asked about testimonials. So here's a little testimonial on the screen for you. I am not going to read it because that seems somehow patronizing. If you want to read it, it is there for you. And if you're curious about testimonials, we'd be happy to share others. Now, getting on past that, one more benefit of joining the Discoverability Network is that job seekers will have access to a free Lumina personality assessment. This costs a couple $100s per person if they were to do it on their own. And it's evidence-based and based on DISC profiles. So I don't know if you've ever done DISC profiles. My previous workplace did it all for our management team. And the real value for job seekers here is it will give them language to use in their resume, cover letter, interviews when they're talking about themselves. And as well, it will help them identify their more dominant and lesser dominant personality traits, as well as strengths and potential areas for improvement. So for anyone who is looking for, what kind of language to use or how to identify those aspects of their personality, talk about them, it's a useful assessment for that reason. Now, when we talk about disclosure, we're obviously talking about it in the context of job searching. And job searching is going to be different for everybody, but generally speaking, there are going to be tools that are used. You're going to have to consider where and how they're looking for jobs, whether disclosure is a part of the story, and where you're going to disclose and how you're going to control that message, as well as what is needed on the job. Right? Some people with disabilities may not need to disclose at all. They may not need an accommodation, in which case the decision to disclose is going to be really more of a personal one, and whether or not they feel like they're being more authentic if they do. So there are a bunch of different considerations to be made. And when we're talking about job search tools, you might think of the formal ones, resume, cover letter, that sort of thing. And when you're considering your elevator pitch or job seeker's elevator pitch, the resume, cover letter that they're using, the references that they use, is disclosure a part of these tools? Are there gaps that need to be identified, and maybe that's why disclosure is occurring? And are the references briefed on how the message is being presented? That's really important, because if the job seeker is choosing not to disclose in their elevator pitch or their resume or cover letter, then it's obviously not going to be a good idea for their references to disclose for them. We want the job seeker to control that message. So things to consider. Then, of course, there are the networking, interview skills, informational interviews, and mentors, people that you speak to outside of formal job applications, or the actual process of speaking to employers, aside from interview skills. Of course, that is actually speaking to employers. But when disclosure is occurring, is it abilities focused? I worked with a gentleman named Ryan Shorten, who used to be the director of operations of Pizza Nova, and he made a great comment after hiring some people, and he said that it should be abilities first and disabilities second. So it's really important that any disclosure is focused on strengths, adaptability, based on experience, and not focused on disability. And then, of course, there are your social medias and websites and portfolios. Again, this sort of connects with the other areas as to whether or not disclosure is occurring unintentionally or intentionally, and the desire and need to control the message. And this is also something to consider with the places where people are looking for jobs, whether it's the Discoverability Network or other various public job boards. Could also be places like LinkedIn, right? When we talk about social media, it doesn't just have to be things like Facebook and Twitter. LinkedIn is obviously the more important one when it comes to looking for work. And so, again, depending on the job search tools being used and what kind of jobs are being sought after, What disclosure may be a viable option, it may be a preferable option, but it may also be something that's not necessary, and job seekers are going to really need to consider why they're disclosing and how they're controlling that message. And we're going to get more into those details as we go through here. But generally speaking, we want to define disclosure as before we really proceed any further. And the way we're describing disclosure here is that it is telling people about the changes you need in the workplace, that would be accommodation, and specifically that you have a disability that or a health condition that necessitates certain changes to the workplace. The changes are what we call accommodations. The changes allow people to do the primary functions of their job. Standards aren't lowered, all of that sort of stuff. But the main point here is that disclosure is not sharing the details of a diagnosis or a personal health condition or anything like that. When someone is disclosing, they don't need to share their actual diagnosis with the employer. The employer cannot ask for a diagnosis or details of the health condition. The employer can ask for a doctor's note documentation on sort of what the limitations in the workplace may be, or what kind of changes somebody might require. But this would look like something as simple as, and I'm going to take an obvious one as an example, but so if a job description requires somebody to lift 40 pounds at a time, and due to a disability someone can only lift 20 pounds at a time, and the employer requests a doctor's note, the doctor's note will not say this person can only lift 20 pounds at a time because they have spinal stenosis or some other disability. The doctor's note will simply say that due to a disability or physical, medical considerations, whatever they may be, this individual can only lift 20 pounds at a time. So the details are not being disclosed. Even when a doctor's note is requested, the details are not disclosed, and the employer can't ask for them. Now, something that is fairly common is people with disabilities are unwilling to disclose. I see there's a question. If a client has a medical disability where they pass out or have seizures regularly, do we have to disclose this to an employer due to WSIB? So I believe I get into that later, but I'm happy to answer it now. It's a good question. They don't have to disclose the details of the diagnosis. Under no circumstance is somebody required to disclose that, say, I have epilepsy, I have seizures. But they are required to disclose that they have a disability if it affects health and safety, whether it's their own or other people's, and if it impacts their ability to do the primary functions of the job. And that's because they can't legally be misrepresenting, what work they're able to do. So an example, I have a relative who has cerebral palsy. She's in a wheelchair. She's obviously not going to get a job that requires her to do 5,000 jumping jacks a day. I wouldn't want to do that job either, but you see the point I'm making. And if she were to apply for a job that, say, required her to do 5,000 jumping jacks a day, she would need to disclose that she has a disability that impacts her ability to do that part of the job. With respect to the seizures, that's I feel like if you're relating it to WSIB, that has more to do with health and safety. And in that case, again, it's disclosing that I have a disability. There is this potential impact on health and safety. They might choose to say, I have seizures, right? They can choose to disclose those details if they want to. But the main point is to disclose there's a disability. It may affect health and safety, why that's the case, and then figure out some accommodations that might be able to be implemented in order to address that. But they don't actually have to share the diagnosis. I realize this gets a bit gray because it can be difficult talking about how a disability relates to health and safety without sharing some of the details. I am simply specifying what the legal parameters are. The actual choice of what and how much to disclose is going to be a personal one that's up to the job seeker. And this isn't a bad lead into the comment on the slide here that 60% of people with a disability state they're unwilling to disclose any information related to a disability. And there are a variety of reasons for that, which I probably don't need to go into. I'm sure you're aware of them, but obviously stigmatization, concerns about discrimination, not being given the job, being viewed differently. There are a whole host of reasons why people may be unwilling to disclose. And sorry, was there a question? All right, if there is, feel free to ask it. Hopefully I'm not hearing things. Hopefully I'm not the only one who heard that.
No, you're not, Donald. I heard it too.
Okay.
Somebody just neglected to mute themselves.
Okay. Well, it makes me feel better that I'm not suffering from auditory hallucinations in the middle of this training. So I think one of the issues when it comes to concerns about discrimination and stigmatization is the way accommodations are discussed. And we talk about this with our employers. Well, our employers, they're not our employers, but we have 1,700, more than 1,700 employers that are using our platform. And so obviously we do a lot of training for employers. We have a lot of interaction with employers. And when we talk to them, one of the things we point out is that disability accommodation is frequently discussed apart from other accommodation considerations, but that doesn't make sense. And I think that's what's contributing to some of the stigma and some of the concerns about discrimination, because most accommodations are not provided for disability, right? I think it's about 95% of accommodations are for personal, family care, religious, and other reasons, not for disability. Yet the conversation about accommodations and disability continues to be one that is apart from other discussions. So it's important for employers to understand that providing an accommodation simply means addressing a barrier. So the barrier needs to be identified. The job seeker is really the best person to tell an employer that a change is required. As employment service providers, obviously we may be supporting the job seeker in terms of determining how to have that conversation, how to phrase that information. But again, they're not legally obliged to disclose unless it's related to health and safety or the ability to do the job. So then the choice to disclose and request an accommodation has to do with considerations of job performance, or what you might call bringing your authentic self to work if people just don't feel like they don't want to hide it, or they feel like they would be hiding it if they don't disclose. But these are the only legal requirements are around health and safety and the ability to do the job. So considerations when disclosing, I think some fairly obvious ones. Is it intentional or unintentional? On social media, which is the second bullet point there, it's very easy to disclose unintentionally. We can get into, call them debates, it's a friendlier word, going back and forth with people. We can become very impassioned, and we can end up saying things, maybe referring to our lived experience if we think that somebody's statements are somehow insensitive or inaccurate. But we can refer to maybe our lived experience or other elements that basically imply, if not outright disclose, that we have a disability, but that may not be a controlled message. It may not be strengths-based. It's more, like I said, impassioned. And if you've ever done anything in a fit of passion, it's not always in a controlled manner in the way that you would want to have done it had you thought it out beforehand. So it's important that we think about what we're saying. Is the approach to disclosure consistent? Is the message the same across all different forums and tools? And is it abilities focused? Remember that quote from my friend there, Ryan Shorten: focus on abilities first and disabilities second. So I've mentioned that disclosing is going to be a personal decision, and these are some of the reasons why it might be more personal than say utilitarian, and considerations that might need to be made. Obviously, if a disability is visible or invisible, is going to change the conversation entirely. Like I said, my relative who has cerebral palsy, who's in a wheelchair, as soon as she enters a room, she's disclosing. So she tends to disclose across all her tools, because then she's controlling the message, as opposed to people finding out for the first time when she enters a room and having their own thoughts, right? She's already controlled that message. But for someone with an invisible disability, that's going to be a very different consideration. The type and severity of disability, the health status, is it temporary or episodic? Is it something that's maybe improving? Is it something that's maybe becoming more pronounced? Is an accommodation required? Like I said, if an accommodation is not required, people may simply choose not to disclose. Now, if the disability becomes more pronounced or starts to affect a job that someone did not require an accommodation before, then of course they should be disclosing, because then if they don't, their performance is going to decline, and it just looks like a performance issue to the employer, which is the last thing that you want. So if a disability does become more pronounced, then they may need to disclose and request an accommodation, even if they didn't need one before. And then, of course, past experiences and context, what you know about the employer, the work environment, that sort of thing, and what the experiences have been in the past when somebody has disclosed are really going to influence their decisions in the future. And that's not always a good thing, because I don't think it's I don't want to say it's common, but I also don't think it's uncommon for people to have maybe bad experiences disclosing or with the way people react to finding out they have a disability. It's regrettable, but true. And that is then going to color their opinion and their decisions of whether or not to disclose in the future. And it may inhibit them from choosing to disclose in situations where they really probably should, and it would be to their benefit because they might be expecting similar negative experiences. So these are all reasons why it's a very personal decision. The main things to remember when disclosing is what information is being chosen to share, right? What are really the salient elements related to disclosure that need to be included in order to achieve whatever is whatever is trying to be achieved or whatever they're looking to get. When disclosure happens, this is probably one of the biggest questions, because it can be at any point. It could be before an interview, during, after a job offer, during probation. Again, it could be someone who didn't need an accommodation and didn't disclose, and maybe 2 years later, for some reason, the disability becomes more pronounced or starts to affect the job, or maybe the job changes and somebody now has to perform functions that do require an accommodation, whereas before they weren't. Then they need to disclose after they've already been doing a job where they didn't require an accommodation. And again, if they don't and they aren't as productive, then it looks like a performance issue to the employer. And you definitely want to get ahead of that. You don't want an employer to think there's a performance issue and start speaking to somebody about a performance issue only to then have that person disclose. It's far better to get ahead of it and, again, control the conversation, control the message. And then who? I think for us, again, probably relatively obvious, someone shouldn't be disclosing to, say, their teammate who's working next to them. They should be disclosing to a person who's in a position to actually implement an accommodation plan, whether that's a manager or a supervisor, a recruiter if it's during the interview process. If someone is going to disclose to colleagues, that's generally not related to accommodations. That's going to be related, again, to that idea of bringing your authentic self to the workplace. I've definitely known people who feel like if they don't disclose, that they're somehow hiding something about themselves. So it's just one example of what that may look like. Now, how people disclose is very important. Tone, body language, words. People should be confident and comfortable with themselves, and it also should come across as a conversation and not demanding, because generally when disclosure is occurring, the next obvious part of the conversation is accommodations. So it shouldn't be demanding, I have a disability and you need to do this. Even though that's technically accurate, the employer's responsibility is to accommodate. It's not really conversational. It's more accusatory, and that's not going to be received as well. So it's important to be factual. Again, governing passions is really important in these discussions. It is a conversation because the employer might be unfamiliar with the individual disability. They might be unfamiliar with accommodations, or they might think they're unfamiliar with accommodations. This is the most common reality. Again, most accommodations aren't related to disability, and I think that's probably why the conversation about accommodations and disability frequently occurs apart from others. But employers have a lot of experience with accommodations. They just might not be used to it being related to disclosure of a disability. So again, it's going to be a conversation. The employer has to accommodate, but they may not provide the requested or preferred accommodation. They just need to provide an accommodation that works. So the employer also chooses the accommodation. And then it's important to explain why, right? The job seeker should be explaining the relevance of the disclosure. Maybe it's related to an accommodation and maybe just an explanation that this is what's going to make me most productive in the role, and I'll be the most effective employee possible for you, and able to do the job to the best of my ability. It could be related to education, or again, just making someone feel like they're more authentic. It could simply be that they don't want to feel like they're hiding something or that they're not being themselves. So it's important to explain why. Don't really just want to walk up to someone and say, hey, I have a disability. You could do that, but generally it's a good idea to explain why you're sharing that information. Now, For the job seekers, you're probably familiar with some, if not all, of these stats, and I won't read them. You're welcome to read them while they're on the screen, some of the elements of the business case of hiring people with disabilities, but it's important for the job seeker to be aware of them too. If you're having the conversation with the employer, along with the job seeker, then that's great because you are able to share this information. But the job seeker should be aware of these statistics, at least some of them as well. In particular, I would say the attendance and the retention rate, because of course those go together and really affect overall operating costs for businesses. But health and safety as well, because there are a lot of misconceptions about health and safety in the workplace amongst people with disabilities. But job seekers need to know this because if they're having a conversation with employers, these kind of statistics are useful for them to be able to quote when they're disclosing. It may make them a little more confident. It may make them feel a little bit better or comfortable if they're able to address right off the hop any potential concerns that the employer may have if they think the employer might be unfamiliar with employing people from this population. So the risks of disclosure I have mentioned a bit. The fear of bias and stigmas right at the top of the list there. Accommodation requests might be denied or costs will be too high. That request is really a bit unfounded in as much as employers can only deny accommodation requests up to the point of undue hardship. And undue hardship is really, it's a high bar. If you're a convenience store on a corner, then no, you're not going to be able to afford to say put in an elevator. But that's an example of undue hardship, right? Most accommodations are nothing like that. Most accommodations are a one-time cost of $500 or less. That's, I think, 93% of them are a one-time cost of $500 or less. So undue hardship is a really high bar, and most employers will not have recourse to that. And they can't legally deny accommodations. But they may not provide the preferred accommodation. And so job seekers need to be prepared for that. The fear of negative consequences, discrimination, right? Not getting the job or a promotion. Most employers do not discriminate. Most employers that we've spoken to really want to be finding ways to be more inclusive, especially in today's climate. But we'd be unrealistic if we were painting a very rose-colored picture and saying that, that never happens. Of course it happens. It's just, it's not the rule. It's more the exception. But nevertheless, it's a legitimate concern. And then, of course, there are other fears as well associated with the risks of disclosure. I mean, we need to acknowledge these and help people understand that, while they may be real, it's like any other concern or fear that we may have. We need to find ways to manage it and address it and move past it. Because the value of disclosure really outweighs a lot of what the concerns or fears may be. Accommodations are going to allow someone to do the job as effectively as possible to the best of their ability, which means they're more likely to thrive in a position as opposed to just make do or struggle to get by. I've spoken ahead of myself, so I've already covered the second bullet point there. But also having the accommodation and also having disclosed so that people know, the employer knows, what you need to succeed in the workplace and is able to provide it, means that people are going to feel more valued, right? Generally speaking, being at work, performing to the best of your ability, it means that you're going to be more satisfied with your position. You're going to feel more committed. You're going to feel like a productive member of the team. And that really positively influences job satisfaction. And then companies are able to actually plan effectively when they have information around what somebody needs to be successful in the workplace. And this is for, people with and without disabilities. If somebody needs something in particular to be successful in the workplace, then they're always going to feel better if they have it, and the company is always going to be in a better position to provide it if they know about it. An employer cannot provide somebody with what they need to be successful if they don't know about it, which is why if you conduct interviews, you've probably asked this question, and you've definitely been asked this question in interviews, but what do you need from us, or what do you need from us to be successful? Right? There's a reason why that question is asked. I know when I asked that question in interviews, I was always hoping people would actually give me a real answer, because I want people to be effective in the role, especially if I'm hiring them and I'm supervising them. I want them to be performing to the best of their ability. It's going to be better for all of us, and it's going to make my job easier. So it is important for companies to be able to plan effectively. Now, I frequently don't stop, so I'm going to stop and just ask, are there any comments or questions that anyone would like to make while I give you a ready-made opportunity to do so? Well, there's nothing and nothing in the chat. Oh, there we go. Okay, there is something in the chat. Would it be possible to get a copy of the slides post-presentation? Oh, yes, of course. I'll put them into a PDF and send them out to Kathy afterwards, as well as a link to a little evaluation survey that's very, very short, I promise, because we appreciate feedback so that we can always improve what we are doing. So moving on, and again, if you think of anything you'd like to ask or comment on, please feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand. But it's important for job seekers when they are disclosing and when they are asking for accommodations to actually know what they need. And this is where identifying the barriers or challenges is important. Knowing what's worked in the past, or if they don't have any experience with it, have an idea of what might work, and understanding what conditions they work best in. So again, that whole knowing what they need to succeed, and again, as employment service providers, this may be something that we are working with them to determine what they might require in certain workplaces to be successful. But if a barrier is going to be identified, it is really important to also be able to suggest what accommodations will help address that barrier. If somebody isn't sure, there are a number of resources they can access. Obviously, yourselves as employment service providers would be I think the first place they should go. But it could be somewhere like the Job Accommodation Network's searchable online accommodation resource. It's a repository of common accommodations for a variety of different disabilities, so that can help get them thinking in one direction or another. But again, they should have some idea of what they need before they go into that conversation. And then again, they shouldn't have to explain this, but they should keep it in mind if depending on where the conversation goes. And again, understanding that accommodations aren't extras, they're not special treatments. They are a right, and they don't really allow a person to do their job. That statement is on the slide and it's technically accurate. I'm not a big fan of it. I really prefer to frame this around accommodations allow people to do a job to the best of their ability, because an employer is not required to hire somebody who cannot do the job. All right, they're hiring somebody who can do the job. They just might need to do it differently, or they might need to do it in a different space or at a different time or something like that in order for them to do it most effectively. So standards aren't lowered. It's just that tasks are completed differently. And of course, there are accommodations for many different things. Accommodations are removing barriers or making changes to the workplace that might address assumptions and unconscious bias, communication. A good example is eye contact. Again, this is what we'll find, any employer will find, is that accommodations made for people with disabilities are frequently also valuable for people without disabilities. Eye contact is the example I used. People with autism have trouble making eye contact. We in the West consider eye contact to be a sign of politeness. And so if somebody is talking to you and they're not looking, well, now I'm sort of looking more at my camera, but if they're talking to you and they're not looking in your eyes, you might consider it rude. But there are other cultures in which eye contact is considered rude. And so specifically, they don't look someone in the eye. And of course, we have a lot of immigration here in Canada. So these understandings of different types of communication or ways of doing things can also make a workplace more accessible for people based on reasons that are not related to disability. Anyway, I digress. Of course, there are accommodations to address ergonomics, such as the sit-stand desk you see pictured there. They could be adaptations to the work environment or spaces, noise-canceling headphones if it's a shared office space, the understanding that someone might wear shades inside if it's very brightly lit and they're sensitive to bright lights, especially if you get migraines like I do, and providing tools or assistive or adaptive devices in order to ensure that someone can actually access their work. So I want to give some examples of accommodations and what the conversation may look like. To begin with, just the conversations, you see a deaf customer service agent is going to explain that the barrier they're facing is that they communicate differently. And so being able to work remotely might be useful, especially because they may have captioning or other software on their computer that allows them to be a part of the team meetings. Written information, obviously, instead of verbal captions. You see ASL interpreter on there. That's an example I'm going to use of where potential undue hardship may come in. An employer is not going to be able to afford to pay for an ASL interpreter for somebody all the time. ASL interpreters are not cheap. Certainly, sometimes people can pay for interpreters for events. Not all organizations can. Certainly not all organizations can all the time. But again, this is why other accommodations may be provided. Someone may prefer to have an ASL interpreter, but the accommodation they're given may be working remotely because they have the right software at home, or being provided with captioning software in the workplace or something like that. Again, the accommodation provided needs to work, but it doesn't have to be the one the job seeker requested. It just needs to address the barrier. So again, job seeker with anxiety who needs to complete timed questions or assessments in an interview. The barrier there is the interview style. Obviously, it's just going to increase somebody's anxiety. So they may state that they would do better with the questions being provided in advance or not doing any timed assessments, and then the interview style might be modified to accommodate them. And then the final example here is an employee who has back pain. The obvious problem there is having to sit in front of a computer for 8 hours a day is bad for your back. I think we all know that, for any of us who sit in front of the computer most of the day. And the accommodation was featured in the last slide. The picture of the sit-stand desk is one option. Then people can continue working without taking breaks. It actually makes them more productive. But if that can't be provided, then it could be an understanding that maybe at the top of every hour, somebody's just going to stretch and walk around for 5 minutes. So again, none of these are particularly expensive. There are multiple options for all of them. And it's a good example of how, again, employers need to provide accommodations that address the barrier, but they may not be the job seeker's first request. So when a job seeker is disclosing a disability, they need to state that they have a disability or a health condition. Again, they don't need to state what the disability or health condition is, but they need to state that it exists. They need to explain how an accommodation will let them do their job most effectively, and how it addresses the barrier or the challenge. They need to identify the barrier or the challenge and how it can be addressed. And then discuss alternatives, right? Providing realistic suggestions is important. Again, this is going to be a conversation. It's a really good idea to go into the conversation with employers, to having an idea of what the job seeker requires to be successful. Some suggestions of accommodations, because the employer then can start to get a sense of what the person needs to address the barrier and be successful. And then the employer, again, they may provide an accommodation that is not what the person asked, but they'll have an idea of what the person needs because of the suggestions the person made. So very important that a job seeker is able to provide these suggestions and is prepared to do so. If they have a job coach with them on site, again, and that person is there for the conversations, that's great. But that's not always the case. And the job coach isn't going to be there forever regardless. So if things change or the job seeker finds themselves in the position in the future where they don't have a job coach with them and they need to have these conversations, it's important they understand how to go into them and what to consider. So some examples of what this may look like. I have a disability, I learn different from other people, and so I need an accommodation in order to be able to present myself as effectively as possible. In the past, having more time to learn all the material has really been helpful. So one-on-one time with a trainer that gives me a chance to ask questions would be really helpful. And then there's a conversation, you go back and forth. And in this example that we obviously contrived, the employer has offered the person an additional week with training, but requiring that they come in early every shift in order to complete it. So maybe not exactly what the job seeker was hoping for, but again, it's an accommodation that addresses the identified barrier and is realistic and workable. So when the job seeker is talking to the employer, whether they're putting posts on their LinkedIn profile, speaking to people, mentors, or having informational interviews, wherever they're having conversations, they need to tailor their message to the conversations. They might, they need to decide whether or not they're going to disclose. They really should have an idea of whether or not they would disclose before they go into a conversation, and who and why. Again, they might disclose to some employers, not others. They need to know what the purpose of their disclosure is. Again, being goal-oriented is a good idea. Being able to explain why they're disclosing and what they're looking to achieve, and it's important for them to know why they're disclosing as well, right? They shouldn't disclose just because. They should disclose for a reason that is really meaningful for them. Again, being abilities focused, abilities first, disabilities second, emphasizing strengths and qualities, including abilities to adapt based on disability, right? People with disabilities often have great adaptability because, well, they have to. And then practicing with people they trust. So that could be yourselves, employment service providers, it could be family, it could be friends, but they need honest feedback, right? They need to know whether or not the way they're presenting the message is the most effective. Certainly with the relative I mentioned who uses a wheelchair, she tends to be fairly willful and dramatic, if I'm being honest. And so a lot of the feedback she got from myself and other people really had to do with just sort of scaling back the way that she spoke about her disability when she was disclosing it, because she may be very comfortable with it, but if she comes on too strong, it might feel like an imposition on others. Should we sign the consent form by client and employer when we disclose information? So no, you don't have to. Now, internal processes aside, I'm assuming in your organizations, you have general consents that clients sign before they go into service. That's usually a pretty standard practice. So I'm assuming you're talking about specifically when someone is disclosing to an employer. And you don't need a consent because it is illegal for the employer to not keep the information confidential, right? Any disclosure is confidential. If the employer shares it with anyone else, then that is a breach of confidence and the employer has violated the law. Now, having said that, it's a good idea to get the conversations in writing, including maybe a summary of who was at the meeting, because then it is in writing who is there. And if an employer does say disclose it to somebody else and break confidence, then you or the job seeker have something in writing to point to saying these are the only people who were at the meeting, right? The employer can't say, oh, but that person was there, and you get into that he said, she said business, and that's just no fun. But no, you don't actually need to have them sign a consent because all disclosure is supposed to be confidential. It's required by law to be confidential. The employer is not allowed to share it with anybody else. So moving on here, there are some strategies. You're welcome. There are some strategies for disclosing. I've implied or referred to some of them, but meeting somewhere that is private and comfortable, right? Don't do it in front of other staff members. Don't do it in the middle of performing a task. Make sure that is the sole focus of what you're doing, or what the job seeker is doing, I should say. Body language and tone, again, important. It's supposed to be a conversation, not an imposition. And the job seeker should, as much as possible, be comfortable speaking about this. This is why they practice. Identifying the barrier, suggesting options, but not providing ultimatums. Again, avoiding that you need to do this. That never goes over well, even if it's true. Answering questions that the employer may have. The employer may be unfamiliar with having these conversations. So questions should not be perceived as an unwillingness to do something. It could simply be a desire to learn more and gather more information. Again, agreeing on the next steps, following up, having a time to follow up and make sure that an accommodation is working, to evaluate and assess its effectiveness, and have the employer write the agreement down and who was in the meeting for the reasons that were just discussed, as well as so you know what you're going back to refer to and talk about in a follow-up. After the person discloses, the employer may ask questions. They may ask about suggestions for accommodations. I've covered that. They may ask about functional limitations or restrictions that are caused by the disability. And again, thank you, Lisa. Again, this is really looking at, if somebody wants information related to an accommodation or a doctor's note, that the job seeker doesn't have to disclose the diagnosis. They are simply stating these are the limitations. They're caused by a disability. If it's a doctor's note, it's basically saying the same thing, except it's from a doctor. It's not disclosing any details of the health condition or the diagnosis. And then the employer is going to decide the accommodation. Again, I've really covered this. It's important to provide suggestions, but it's important for the job seeker to be flexible and understand that the employer is not necessarily going to provide the job seeker's preferred accommodation. And the job seeker needs to be willing to try out accommodations that are offered. This is why it's important to have a review date. to see if it's working. Maybe the accommodation that they're offered works, and that's fabulous. Maybe it doesn't work and they need to try something else. But they should be willing to try it because they're, they need an accommodation that addresses the barrier. But again, they may not get the accommodation they're asking for. They may be in a shared office space, and they might see a grand office at the end of the hall, and you say, I need to work in that grand office there because I can't work in a shared office space because of all the noise. And they find out, well, that's the CEO's office. You can't work in there. But we have this other office that's not so great. It's kind of small, but it's quieter. And that's not the preferred accommodation. They don't get the fancy office, but they do get a space where they can work. Or maybe it's noise canceling headphones. Maybe the employer doesn't have an office to give them, in which case there needs to be some other accommodation made to address this barrier. So they need to be willing to try what's offered. And again, I've mentioned having the written accommodation plan in place, that it is a conversation, and that they should have a review date with the employer selected so that they can evaluate and assess the accommodation and decide whether or not a new accommodation needs to be tried. And look at that. I actually got to the ending with some time left over. So if there are questions, again, please feel free to ask them. I do appreciate the questions that came through during the presentation. They were very topical. But if you have any thoughts, maybe you don't have questions, maybe you just have thoughts to share, experiences of people you've worked with, please feel free to do so now. I'm going to leave this on the screen for just a moment in case you want to take any of it down, although it will be on the slide deck that I share. I'll put my contact information in the chat. You are certainly welcome to reach out to me. We're happy to, we'd love to discuss how we can work with your organizations to support and enhance the work you're doing. And I'll stop talking for a moment now. It would seem sort of self-serving to answer this poll myself, so I'm going to politely decline.
Just
come on, Donald.
Talk yourself up.
I mean, I could do that. It's not really in my nature to do that.
Okay, if there are no questions for Donald, going once, going twice. It was an excellent and very thorough presentation. I really, would it be possible to arrange a presentation for a group of clients?
Oh, yes, of course. As I said, we do these trainings for all of our stakeholder groups. And that's why I put my email in the chat. You'll have more contact information for our program on the slide deck I send out. But please take down my email and contact me. If you would, you'd like us to provide any training for your job seekers. There are a number of ways that we work with employment service providers to, as I said, enhance and support the work that you're doing. So absolutely, we'd be happy to do that. Please reach out and we'll discuss what we can, how we can collaborate and what we can do to support you.
Fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much, Donald, for spending your hour with us during Wednesdays at 1. Really enjoyed the session and learned a few things, and always great to have a couple of takeaways. I really like the goal setting aspect of working with your client, and I'm sure that some of our frontline practitioners have got some new tools in their toolbox. So thank you very much. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everyone.
And if you haven't had a chance to answer the poll, please do before you leave. But thank you, Donald. It was great.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Take care, everybody.
You too.